Welcome to APA's weekly webinar series. My name is Billy Zydick, Standards and Codes Administrator for APA. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. The webinar recording will be posted to the APA webpage later this afternoon. You will receive a follow-up email in the next couple of days with a link to the webpage where all webinar recordings are housed, as well as a link to our upcoming webinar. We have webinars planned out through April 2020, and they are now open for registration. All attendees are in listen-only mode. Please type your questions in the chat box, and they will be answered in the order they are received. If we run out of time and we still have questions, responses will be sent directly to the person asking the question by our presenter. Professional continuing education credits and AIA CLUs are being offered. For AIA certificates, please send me an email at billie, B-I-L-L-I-E, @apa.org with your membership number. Also, to request a certificate, if you did not indicate you wanted one when you registered, just send me an email. Also, if you have more than one person attending this session from a central location, just contact me so everyone gets credit for attending. At this time, it's my pleasure to turn this over to Ted Widener. Ted, take it away.
Thank you, Billy. I want to talk today about design build project delivery and what facility officers need to know about design build compared to other delivery methods that you're probably more familiar with. I am certified by the DesignBuild Institute of America and teach the design build method to students here at Purdue University. And ever since I started teaching it, I've seen a 400% increase in the number of students taking the course. So it's very nice to see. Just as a reminder, this is an AIA continuing education program, and Billy's provided you most of the information about it. Today we are going to talk about the elements of capital construction, the differences between project delivery methods. We're going to outline the design build project delivery method and how it would affect facility owners, and show you how to consider which method to use for your projects. First of all, what is design build? It's an option among many options for getting a building or other infrastructure constructed at your campus or facility. One of the primary differences between design build and many other project delivery methods is that design build uses a single contract for both design and construction. You may be familiar with design bid build, which uses two contracts, a contract between the owner and the designer, and then a separate contract between the owner and the contractor. And in that method, where there are two contracts, the owner is in the middle. There is no true connection between the designer and the contractor. If you use something like construction management, there are some differences there, but there's still at least two contracts. So design build is simpler because there's only one contract for you to worry about. The other important thing to recognize with design build is that it will allow you to have more performance-based specifications rather than technical specifications. And by that I mean you get to specify how you want the building to operate, and it becomes the contractor's responsibility. And we'll talk about that a little bit further, the added risk to the contractor for having that responsibility of how the building operates. At present, design build is available in the DesignBuild Institute of America shows 4 different ways of design build being limited. The 3 states where it's in gray, and this is as of August 2017, I couldn't find anything more recent, there's very limited use of design build in public projects. And as the color green gets darker, why use of design build to construct a project at your campus becomes better. If you're at a private institution, it doesn't matter what these colors are. You can do whatever you feel like doing because you're a private entity. But for public entities, you need to be somewhat aware of what your state allows you to do for contracting. So the first question I've mentioned a couple of them already, is how many project delivery methods do you think there are? Well, I've mentioned earlier design, bid, build, which is the traditional method where the owner hires a architect or engineer to design something, and then they take the final design, bid it out to a group of contractors, or they may, if it's a private entity, they may go to a favorite contractor, or they may negotiate the price. And then a contract is signed with the contractor to construct the facility that has been previously designed. A variation on that is construction management agency. You may still have a separate designer, and then in this case, the construction management agency, you hire a construction manager who would then be in charge of finding contractors or subcontractors to construct the design facility. In some cases, the construction manager participates during the design phase, but that's not a requirement. A variation on that is construction management at risk. And again, the construction manager may be involved during the design stage, have some input in the design, but there's still a separate contract with the construction manager. And when they're at risk, they have a little bit more responsibility for making sure the project gets done the right way, very similar to design, bid, build. The project is designed completely by the designer, and then the construction manager takes over and constructs the facility. And then we have design build, which, as I said before, is a single contract method. The design build team is selected by the owner in a number of different ways, and I'll talk about that later on. The designer and the contractor work together to develop the design. They work with the owner and get the facility constructed. In some cases, the price is known well in advance of the design being finished, and that helps speed things along. And then there's one other method that is somewhat similar to design build, and that's integrated project delivery. I'm not going to talk about that in much detail today, other than to say that there's a way of spreading the risk around between the designer, the contractor, and the owner using integrated project delivery. And you may or may not like that depending on your appetite for handling risk. So the next question I've got is that all the project delivery methods that exist? Well, not necessarily. Let's think about the factors of capital construction. We have things that we worry about, such as cost. We worry about how much time it will take to get the facility constructed. We may worry about the scope of the project. How big is it? How detailed is it going to be? How complex? That sort of thing. And then we may also worry about the risk. When I was early in my career, getting buildings constructed, I was told you've got three things, and whether it's cost, time, and scope, or cost, time, and risk, you could only control two of them. And the third one was out of your control. Well, with design build, you've got a little bit more control over that third factor. So let's first talk about cost. We have several different ways of looking at the cost of a project. We can do low bid, and that is where the typical public owners will get a completed design, bid it out, and then they will take the lowest responsible bidder. An alternative way would be to select a contractor that you know does a good job and ask them to give you a good price because you know they're going to do a good job. And that's more along the lines of best value, but you're still paying attention to the total cost of the project. Another way of looking at project delivery is construction management at risk. And oftentimes the construction manager is selected based on the fees that they charge for the project. Or you may choose the construction manager based on their qualifications. They've done so many science buildings, or they've done so many dormitories, that sort of thing. I'll skip down to the bottom and talk briefly about IPD, Integrated Project Delivery. And you would select a contractor or design team based on the fees that they would charge you for constructing the facility, while still obviously paying for the whole project. Or you might choose them based on their qualifications. And just to make sure everyone knows, qualification-based selection is similar to what you've seen before in choosing an architect or an engineer. And in some cases, the state law requires you to use qualification-based selection when you are hiring and selecting an architect or an engineer. Now let's jump back up to design build. And in the heavy construction industry, this is called engineer, procure, and construct. But we're not going to talk about heavy construction. We're going to be focused mostly on buildings today. You can use a design build method and get a low bid price. You can use the design build method and you can specify what you want and get best value. Best value is a combination of the size of the facility that you want constructed, the price of that facility, maybe the quality of the materials, that sort of thing. And you're going to have to identify in advance what your definition of the value is going to be. You could also choose the design build team based on the fees that they would charge you. In that setting, you would pay for what the actual construction costs were, whatever the subcontractor said each different part of the building would cost, the foundations, the structure, the building envelope, and so on. You'd pay that, and then you'd pay another percentage on top of that for the design and the management of the project. And that would be a best value fees based selection. Or you can go overall and say that you want to have a qualification-based selection of your design build team. You can consider cost in there, but usually cost is not weighed very heavily, but you're looking at the qualifications of the design build team who will be designing the facility for you, identifying materials and features of the facility, and then constructing it for you, maybe as quickly as you would like to see it constructed. So again, there's low bid, and that's where the cost of the facility counts 100%. There's best value, and we would weight things somewhere between 0 and 100% for a number of different factors, and you would choose the design build team based on some kind of weighting criteria. Then there's best value fees, and you would again choose the design build team, or in this case, if you were doing construction management instead, you would choose the construction manager based on their fees. And then lastly, qualification-based selection, you're ignoring the price and you're looking mostly at qualifications of the team, the best designer for a science building versus the best designer for a classroom building or a dormitory, or the qualifications of the contractor to deliver the project on time for you. Now let's look at time. So we can consider the time to construct the facility as being very important. Back in the 80s, when interest rates were very high, it became a big deal for how long it took to get the project designed and constructed. And back in those days, maybe even in the 70s really, and folks probably recall that they've seen something about Paul Volcker dying earlier this week. He was the one that drove interest rates up over 20% for even houses. So having your money tied up, paying 20% to borrow it was a big deal. You wanted to get the facility constructed so you could use it and start charging rents. And that's when things like Fast Track came along in order to shorten up the amount of time between when the design occurred and when you could finally use the project. So design build allows things to get done a little bit faster. CM at risk can get things done a little bit faster still. And then depending on how you do your design build, you can specify what you want, get your best value or qualification, best qualified individual or design build team, and get it done even faster still. And then lastly, we could consider scope or risk together. And in that case, I draw on a standard figure that is used to identify the difference between cost and your ability to influence changes within the design. In a traditional method, where the design happens first, we look at the red line and the red shaded area. In planning, to influence the design, you have a high amount of influence and a very low cost with design bid build. But once you bid the project out, if you want to make a change, that change order can be very expensive. And in some cases, it'll be extremely expensive because work that's in place has to be ripped out and rebuilt. So it'd be a very high cost when you bring it into operations. Whereas in other settings, there may be a higher cost to influence change, and with design build, your costs are generally lower all the way through the project until things get put into place. So which one should you be choosing? Well, it's not quite as easy as saying I'm going to throw a dart and see which one of these four options are selected. Let's look at a couple things first. So we'll consider price, we'll consider qualifications of the team, and decide what kind of design build method we want to have. So if we have a low bid project, we'll consider things in one way. If we have qualifications-based selection at the other extreme, we'll think of things a little differently. First thing with low bid, we want to identify what's the total cost for the design and construction of the facility. Do qualifications matter? No, they don't matter. And so we will then select a low bid design build project delivery method as a result. Alternatively, if we're looking solely at the qualifications of the design build team, we don't worry about the price, so to speak. We're willing to pay the price because we've chosen the team based on qualifications. Qualifications are the most important, and so we follow essentially a design build qualification-based selection method. Now, a lot of times it's too painful for a board of trustees, a board of governors, to allow you to pick the most qualified firm. They want to know that they're getting the best price also. They want high value, but they want it cheap, so to speak. So we have a couple variations in between, where we have some kind of competitive sealed bid price, and we have a proposal that we select that gives us the best value. And we can break this down into two forms, Form A and B, where price and other criteria are used to select the design build team. In that case, we're looking at the total design and construction cost. We're looking at the qualifications of the design build team. Have they done similar projects? And I'll show you what that contract form looks like shortly. Or are we going to look at some kind of combination of price and fees to get us our selection? And so we will consider the price of the design build fees, the cost of general conditions, any contingency that's built into the project. And obviously we look at their qualifications. So in the 2A version, we're looking at best value but total cost. And in 2B, we're looking at best value based on the fees. What does all of this mean overall? The Design Build Institute of America has commissioned some research from Penn State University, and again, the most recent numbers I have here are from 2004. I think there's a more recent version, but this will do for now. And we've discovered that, the researchers have discovered that on cost per square foot, if you just go to a contractor and say, build me this design, that the numbers run 14% higher. Whereas if you pick the contractor based on the qualifications, they were 50% or 4% higher. In the case of choosing based on best value, it was 50% higher. And in the case of just low bid, obviously that would have been the lowest price. I'm not going to go through all the other details in this chart, other than to say that you're looking at a number of different things: the unit cost per square foot, whether the cost is going to grow or not due to change orders or unforeseen conditions, whether the project is faster or slower than others, and the delivery speed includes not just the construction time, but it also includes the planning and design time also. And then what does the schedule look like? You certainly want to have the project, particularly if it's something like a dormitory and you want the dormitory to open in August so students can move in for the semester. You don't want to pick somebody who has a record of delivering a project late. You want it delivered on time, if not early. And so this bottom one is very important. You want to see the lowest schedule growth as possible. So what are the major differences between traditional construction methods or project delivery methods of design, bid, build compared to design build? And I've already mentioned some of these. In traditional method, there's two contracts. There's one between the owner and the designer, and another one between the owner and the builder. That puts the owner in the middle whenever there's a question about the design, about details, what's going on, that sort of thing. And so the owner is really stuck in the middle of that arrangement. In design build, there's just one contract. If there's a question about the design, the owner may be brought in to discuss it, but the design build team is responsible to resolve it on their own. And if they've already given you a price, you don't have to worry about seeing a change order because they've already dealt with the price for you. In a traditional delivery method, the owner guarantees the design accuracy to the builder. This may be a bit of a surprise to you, but if you pay very close attention to almost any set of standard design bid build documents, you will see that the owner has guaranteed the accuracy of the plans and the specifications to the low bid contractor so that they can give you a guaranteed low bid price based on the accuracy of your documents. In the case of design build, the owner is really specifying performance, and the design build team is supposed to be delivering based on the performance requirements that the owner has. The design build team is responsible for the accuracy of the design. In traditional method, the owner controls the design. You may sit in design meetings with the architect and engineer for months, getting exactly what you want. And if that's your preferred way of working, that's fine. I would caution you about using design build, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. In the design build method, the owner controls the requirements and then relies on the design build team to provide those requirements and meet your needs. In the case of a dormitory, that's so many beds in the dormitory, some features associated with it, whether there's private bathrooms or not, and whatever you want to specify. You identify your requirements. In the case of traditional method, it's a very linear process. The design gets started, you work your way through the different phases of design, schematic design, design development, contract documents. When your design is 100% or as close as the designer is going to give you, then you put it out to bid. In the case of design build, it can be a very parallel process where the design is partially complete and the contractor gets started. One example may be that the designer has finished the foundation design of the building, but they're still working on what the walls are going to look like. The contractor, in order to get things moving faster, will dig the foundation, construct the foundation, start putting up the structure. As the design is prepared and ready, the contractor takes it and starts working on it. In traditional method, the owner bears the risk of the building working the way the owner wants it to. This is a real challenge here. You think that the contractor owes you a building that works the way you want. Well, if the designer has developed the project for you, for the owner, and the owner was in control of the design, but the design doesn't work, it's not the contractor's problem, it's the owner's problem. And that's why we've developed a number of things such as building commissioning to try to overcome some of those risks. In the case of design build, the contractor bears the risk of the building performing the right way because the owner said how they want the project to perform. And that was how you selected the design build team. And then lastly, this is a small thing that we've been talking about already, and that is design bid build. We've been doing that for well over 100 years. Private owners are accustomed to it, public owners are accustomed to it, so it's allowed universally. In the case of design build, any private owner can do it, and most public settings can do it, and you really have to double check the laws in your state if you're at a public institution. So the advantages of design build are that it minimizes disputes between the builder and the designer. There's one contract. That's great. You only have one contract to worry about. It can go faster as a result because the design team and the construction team can be working in parallel, just in different parts or different phases of the building. In design build, the builder can talk about constructability issues with the designer during the design portion, they can identify ways of getting the project done more conveniently, faster, and in many cases, the owner is there to hear about that stuff and may be approving it. It's also possible for the subcontractors to have a voice in what's going on, and you can even get your own staff involved. And then it is also possible with DesignBuild to have a completely open book. Again, this varies depending on the details of the contract, but you can see exactly what's going on with where the money is being spent. Is it being spent on the windows or on the carpeting or on something else that's more important for you? Whereas if you choose a design bid build method and the contractor is giving you a low price, you don't see the details of where the money is really being spent. That's the contractor's business, and they won't share it with you. So what do you get out of the differences between design build and design bid build? Well, one of the things that you get with design build is you get the added creativity of not just the designer, but of the contractor. And if you've done a good job selecting a contractor, you've got one that has done a number of similar projects before, and they're giving you some great ideas. The owner also gets the assurance that your performance goals will be met. And that can be very important depending on the project that you're working on. You can get your project done faster from when the design starts until you can walk in the front door, and you get fewer problems with constructability, and that usually means fewer change orders. The contractor has to deal with those things. You don't ever see a change order in some cases. Of course, if you're going to get something, you have to give up something. And in the case of design build, the designer is frequently a consultant to the builder. That's in large part because the builder or the contractor has the ability to get a performance bond and insurance to get your project constructed much more easily than the designer, who usually only has about 5 to 10% of the value of the project in their scope of work. So the designer sometimes plays second fiddle to the contractor. You give up some control in the design details or some materials and equipment because the contractor has given you a price, and if you haven't identified what you want in advance in your performance requirements, well, you may not get those things. There's some sense of the cost being better, but not always. It's because you're picking the design build team based on their qualifications, their ability to get the job done and get it done quickly for you. So you may give up a little bit in cost, and then you don't have a whole lot of control during the construction phase. But you've already picked your contractor based on their ability to get things done. There are some disadvantages of design build, and I've mentioned them briefly. It's in some cases it may be unfamiliar to some folks, and that could be a challenge for you. You may compromise with the designer. You need to have a thorough program for your facility. Some people call it a basis of design. Pay very close attention to those front end things to make sure you know exactly what you want and you've spelled it out very clearly. You have some loss of control over the design. Issues of color, that's not a big deal. Those are pretty much zero cost. But exactly how wide corridors are, the contractor will give you what's required by code, but they won't necessarily give you a really wide corridor, as an example. It's somewhat harder to evaluate between different firms. If you've never done design build before, you may find it advantageous to have a consultant help you with the design build process so you can weigh the difference between the different variations of best value selection. And again, sometimes quality may play second fiddle due to your focus on getting things done faster. Of course, you can always balance those two out. You can say, well, I'm willing to have the project go a little bit slower so that I can spend my money more wisely on good quality. So let's look at some details of how some of this works out. So in direct design build, where you specify things somewhere between the early planning stage and early design, we're somewhere around -10 to +10%. If you choose based on criteria, how you want the project done, and again, this would be where maybe you hire a separate firm to develop some sketches for you, and then you pick those and you then present that to a design build team. You're somewhere between 5 and 25% of the design being done. You can also hire a separate designer to, if you're interested in controlling what the project looks like, you'll hire a separate designer, and then that designer develops bridging documents that you then take to interested design build teams and have them find ways of making improvements in the design, but also getting the job done for you quickly. This is a very popular method in a public setting, in a public institution. That this does mean that you end up having two contracts. You have a contract with your bridging designer, the firm that gets the design to, let's say, the schematic design stage, maybe a little bit beyond, and then you take your project out on the street to firms and get a qualification-based selection designer and contractor on board, where they identify a price for you and get you your project in the time frame that you want also. And then lastly, there's the where you bring the design much farther along beyond the schematic design stage. It's still considered bridging, but there's very little design input on the part of the design build team. And they're really there to finish up the documents and then get the project constructed. Elements of bridging, and this is important for all of you public owners out there, the owner has to have some basis of design. You hire, as I mentioned earlier, you hire the bridging designer. They develop the project using a traditional method, spending a lot of time with the client, generally taking the project through schematic design. And then you issue that design for proposals from design build firms. Those firms will then respond with recommended changes in the design and or a price. And someplace in there, the price is settled, but the design isn't 100% done yet. The design build firm is selected, and then they complete the design and construct the project. Overall, balancing out cost, time, and scope of the project, you can focus solely on cost, where you get a request for qualifications and you have a lump sum price. Or you can focus on time and cost with a similar contract all the way down to the bottom right corner, where your only concern is the risk of cost escalation, risk of the project working the way you want it to work. In that case, you spend time focusing on your performance expectations and select a design build team overall. the owner has to pay close attention to how they really want to manage the job. And so in some cases, you really have to change your thinking from focusing on the design to focusing on the function. And that can be a challenge for many folks at your campus because they're more accustomed to focusing on the design. But it allows you to focus your attention on the details of the function and the performance of the facility, how you really want it to work. Then you get to delegate the design details to the design build team and commit to the decisions when the design build team comes to you saying, do you want style A or do you want style B? Do you want this piece of equipment or that piece of equipment? You need to make those decisions in a reasonable time frame, and then you have to commit to them throughout the project. But overall, the design build delivery method is a great way of getting projects done on your campus. I've done design build projects at numerous projects in numerous institutions and have helped other universities develop the process at their institution. It allows you to control the design to a reasonable amount. It allows you to have discipline and responsiveness in changes. You take advantage of time cost trade-offs, and you get a completed building that performs the way you want to for the price you are willing to pay. So that concludes my presentation. I apologize, we've only got about 15 minutes for Q&A, but let's see what questions are out there.
Okay, thank you. Once you've started down the path of any of the methods, how difficult is it to change methods?
It'd be pretty difficult. I don't advise that unless you're looking at, well, let me clarify. If the question is, how hard is it to change from design bid build to design build, I don't recommend that. You really need to do an analysis up front. What's important to you? What rules do you have to follow? And how do you want to have the project delivered? So if price and time are both important, more important than the quality of the project or your ability to control the design, then you choose design build. If you're more concerned about being in there, specifying exactly what kind of brick you want, what kind of carpet you want, and so on, then you want to go design bid build.
Okay. Is there a trend in higher education toward or away from DB, and what are the reasons?
I'm finding more people are interested in design build rather than design bid build. Now maybe it's my bias. I like design build because you're choosing the whole project delivery team based on their qualifications to do a good job for you. You also focus in on what's important to you. How do you want the facility to perform? How do you want the overall building to work? And the design build team will get it for you, or at least it's their responsibility. It's really a matter of making sure that you're able to convince the fiduciary group, usually that's the board of trustees, that that's the right way to do it. But it takes a lot of headaches out of the capital delivery team's hands and puts them into the consultant's hands, where they're usually better at controlling some of the risks associated with your project than you are.
Okay, thank you. What is the percentage scale on slide number 24?
Slide 24. Okay, so that's looking at solely at the design phases. So schematic design is usually somewhere around, takes you up to 25%. Design development phase will take you to 50 to 60%. and then 100%, that's 100% design documents in that scale. So that's just looking at the design. That's not looking at construction. The construction is going to be totally different.
Okay, thank you. How does this process change when you get involved in a P3?
How does this change when you get involved in a P3? Okay, so a P3 is a public-private partnership. You could use any project delivery method at all in a public-private partnership, but that's something that would be defined in the P3 agreement. Usually when you get a private entity involved in your project, they're going to be leaning more toward design build, simply because they have skin in the game as well, and they're trying to get a project that's done economically and quickly so that they can start seeing the income from their P3 agreement with you. But when you write it the right way, your concern is the condition of the facility, let's say 50 years from now. And so you want to make sure your P3 agreement addresses the condition of the facility at some time in the future when the P3 agreement has reached its termination.
Okay, thank you. Should there be a provision if substitutions are being used in the DB?
When you say substitutions being used, if you want to have control over different things, let's say you want to have an absorption chiller instead of a centrifugal chiller. There's cost implications and a number of other issues associated with that. If you want to be involved in that level of detail, that's something you can specify in the performance of your project and how you want to work. Do that early on. You're completely within your rights to do that because you're going to be the owner or you're the owner's rep. But you say that early on, and you don't worry about it once you have signed an agreement. You've taken care of those details. So all we're really doing is we're moving details like that. Instead of figuring them out at the end of the job, you're specifying how you want things to perform and to operate, and you're saying that at the very beginning of your job.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, Dana.
Yeah, I would just add on to that the owner should be looking at whether or not they want to see submittals, because oftentimes you will have, with the design builder, the designer and the builder pass submittals on between themselves. If you haven't specified, as Ted said, exactly what goes into the job, and you may not even see that until it actually arrives on the job site. So we always had that we wanted to be, in addition to specifying things, if the mundane things, we also wanted to see the submittals and offer ourselves an opportunity to comment before the purchase was made.
Thank you. What are your thoughts on lean design versus DB?
Lean is yet another variation that you could apply to design build or design bid build. It's really a way of working as opposed to a project delivery method. If the owner wants things to move along quickly, you need to select a team, whether it's a designer and or design build team or just a contractor who has a lean focus. And that's just a different area totally. It's not a contracting method, it's an attitude.
Thank you. Does design build selection consider factors other than price requiring strong institutional procurement controls to avoid inappropriate outside influence on contractor selection?
Okay, so when you start a design build qualification selection process, whether it's best value or some other variation, the first thing you need to do is make sure whomever is on the DB selection team has been trained on how the process works, including the selection process. Typically, members on the team are required to sign a maybe a conflict of interest agreement. They also have to sign a confidentiality agreement, because in the best value selection process, essentially what's happening here, and I skipped over it, when you put your project out on the street, you're going to receive qualifications from a number of different firms. You'll narrow it down to, let's say, 3 different teams, and then you'll work with those 3 different teams on your project program, or how you want the facility to operate. They're going to come up with their own designs, or they may come up with variations of what your bridging documents have. And you get to comment on the success or the failure of their ideas. To prevent contamination across teams, you have to maintain confidentiality between your discussions. And then it's really a management issue after that to make sure that 1 or 2 individuals are not telling the whole selection team how to vote. But essentially what you have, one way of doing that is you identify the criteria that you're going to use in advance. You identify the points that you're going to assign to each one of those criterion, and that's published in advance, so everybody knows that the design is 50% and the price is 25% and the schedule is 25%, or whatever combination of more or less that you want to consider in there. And then you go from that point on and you make your decision. So in order to avoid having these conflict of interest issues, which I think is what the question is really focused on, you identify everything, how you're going to evaluate your project early on. That's part of your so-called bid documents.
Thank you. Is lack of upfront capital forcing owners to go DB using bolt arrangement?
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand the question.
Okay.
You used an acronym in there that I didn't understand. You said BOLT?
Yeah, B-O-L-T.
I'm not familiar with that either.
Yeah.
Okay. Derek, if you could tell us what BOLT stands for, and we'll get back to your question.
Yeah, we'll answer that offline.
Okay. With project financing, does DB present any additional challenges, financial, political, or other?
Maybe political, but financial. I mean, the nice thing about design build, oftentimes you're going to have in your selection criteria the time to have the project delivered, and the contractor has to meet that, as opposed to a contract where you may say what you want when you want the project delivered, but you can't guarantee the schedule that the contractor has to follow. There can be penalties and so on, but the financing is the same, other than it might be a shorter financing window where you have to borrow the money.
Okay, got an answer. BOLT is similar to P3, build, operate, lease, transfer.
Oh, okay. I call that DBOM, design, build, operate, and maintain. So, read the question again, please.
Okay. Is lack of upfront capital forcing owners to go DB using BOLT arrangement?
Okay. In some cases, yes. And it's not necessarily the upfront capital. It may be the ability to borrow more money, so that you can have situations where, and I'm seeing this a lot right now in higher ed, an awful lot of dormitories were constructed in the 60s and 70s to deal with the influx of students. We're at 50 years now. Those buildings have been old and worn out. And so money was borrowed against those buildings to refurbish them, modernize them, add air conditioning where you didn't used to have air conditioning, that sort of thing. And now the institution has used up all of its borrowing capacity. And so there may be the only option available to build more dormitories or a new dining center or a recreation facility would be some kind of a design, build, operate, and maintain arrangement where the university is going to pay a contractor to an annual fee, let's say, to design and build and then operate a dormitory that is used to house students on campus. We have something like that here at Purdue. I can't remember what all those details are, but that's yet one more way of controlling your operating costs, controlling your borrowing costs, and still getting a lot of construction projects done on campus.
Okay. Our next question is, how do you control quality, keeping in mind that campuses design facilities for at least 50-year life expectancy? In DBB, it's controlled by campus standard details and specifications. If performance is the only criteria, you can't check quality within the 1-year warranty period.
True, but there's nothing that says that the contractor doesn't have to follow your design and construction standards. You just put that in the front. So follow our design and construction standards, but the building has to operate this way, and you can do it.
Yes, exactly. That's the way we had it at our UNH contract. Was we had performance construction standards, and the design builders needed to follow those, or specifically show us where they wanted exemptions from them that we had to approve.
Okay, we have one more question here. Does Purdue use DB? And if so, what type of projects does it decide to use DB?
We have used DB. One project was a facade, essentially replacement, but it was probably called a facade restoration project. We've used them on dormitories, although generally right now, because the university is watching its pennies very carefully, some of those dormitory projects are DBOMs or BOLT, either acronym. But you can do design build for anything. The Design Build Institute of America has a separate group that looks at civil infrastructure, such as water treatment plants. You can do something for a highway, for your steam distribution system. It's really only limited by your imagination, your ability to write down your performance criteria and find a contractor who's willing to tackle the job.
I agree completely with Ted. We have done the run-of-the-mill things, residence halls and dining halls, but also wind tunnels and veterinary lab facilities by design build. So it's not limited.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. We're coming up to the top of the hour. We have one more webinar next Thursday, and it will be outlining the current custodial guideline, the APA custodial guideline, and they're going to give you a presentation of what the new edition will look like. After that, we'll take a hiatus until the end of February. So if I don't talk to any of you before then, I want to wish you everyone a very happy holidays, and we'll start our webinars again, like I said, again in February. So Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah to everyone, and we'll talk again soon. Bye-bye now.